on Facebook. So if you do not wish to be seen, please make sure that you switch off your video. My name is Elsa Marie De Silva, and I'm the founder of Red Dot Foundation. And I'm one of the co-hosts for this session, The Importance of Digital Rights and Safety Education in Mainstream Education Curriculum. So welcome. My co-host is Napanai NS. She is an advocate Supreme Court, and she's also the founder of Cybersathi. And the two of us are alumni of the Chevening program, which is part of the British Foreign Office program for Indians as well as people around the world. And this panel discussion culminates the program that we've been doing over the last 6 months for them, where we've hosted workshops in schools and colleges for 1,000 young people on digital rights and safety. And so we are going to talk about why such curriculum is important, but also what is the reality that makes this curriculum important. And before I do that, I'd like to again welcome people who are just joining in. So good evening, everyone. My name is Elsa Marie De Silva. I'm the founder of Red Dot Foundation. I want to remind everyone that we are recording this session and we are live streaming it on Facebook. So if you don't wish to be seen, please switch off your video. Also make sure that you're on mute so that you don't disturb the speakers and we can hear everyone clearly. I would encourage everyone to put in the chat section, who you are, where you're located, which organization you represent, and what brings you here. We would love to connect with you, even post this session so that we can collaborate. This is a very important topic and we need everyone to be engaged and involved. The flow for today is I'll just give you a brief on why I think this topic is important. And then I'm going to introduce my three guests, actually one co-host and two guests. And then we will open it up for questions from you. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat section. So why are we talking about the importance of digital rights and safety education? Because, it is really important because we found that in the age groups of 17 to 18, they are particularly vulnerable to cyberbullying, and approximately 80% of this age group was cyberbullied during the lockdown period. As you know, during the lockdown period, all our lives went pretty much onto the digital space, whether it's education, whether it's work, whether it's even leisure. And all our screen times have gone up or shot up dramatically. Before the lockdown period, around 79% of the respondents that were bullied offline were also cyberbullied after the lockdown period, which means that the virtual space or the digital space actually reflects what's happening in the real physical world. So your socio-cultural norms that govern a lot of our behavior and which we are subjected to also translates and transcends this space. And 67% of the respondents that were bullied offline continued to be cyberbullied even amidst the lockdown. And those are high numbers. Recently, we partnered with Bumble India. Bumble is a dating app. And they did a nationwide survey which found that 83% of women have experienced online harassment of some kind, with 1 in 3 reporting that they experience it weekly, which is extremely high. And it's worsened since the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, where Indian women report that 70% believe cyberbullying has increased since the lockdown began. So in September last year, we, that is Napanai, through her foundation and us at Red Dot Foundation, we partnered on a workshop curriculum called Cybersathi, that is cybercrime awareness through a gender lens, reaching out to 1,000 children across India. And with the US consulate, we are doing it for 5,000 children. So in all, 6,000 children. And the idea was to reach this young demographic who are constantly, they are digital natives, but they're constantly on these spaces, whether by choice or through peer pressure, and equip them with a clear understanding of the possible cyber threats that they may be susceptible to. Also, how to protect themselves from such threats and vulnerabilities. What are the remedies available in the law? Because if you're not aware, India has all the laws that are required, but people are not knowledgeable about these laws. And in the event they fall prey to perpetrators online, or if they know someone who has fallen victim to cyber offenses, how can they be first responders in such situations? And so build this ecosystem of support where they can recognize what has happened to them, identify it as a crime, and then use the formal judicial system for remedial measures, as well as take peer support through their ecosystem of friends, family, teachers, etc. So today with me, I have three wonderful guests, very accomplished guests. So we have Ms. Napinai NS. She's Advocate Supreme Court of India and founder of Cybersaathi. Welcome, Napinai. Good evening. We have Mr. Samir Unhale. He is the Joint Commissioner, Directorate of Municipal Administration, Government of Maharashtra. He's still working, so don't be surprised if you see him in his office. Good evening, Samir. Welcome. And Dr. Harsh Purohit, he's the Dean, FMS Wisdom, and at the Office of the Dean, Jamna Lal Bajaj School of Legal Studies, Banasthali University. We've partnered with him on the Cybersaathi workshops. In fact, we kick-started the Cybersaathi workshops in February last year in person before the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to start with Napinai first. Maybe you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself, and also, tell us why do you think that digital rights and safety education is important?
Thank you so much, Elsa, for that wonderful introduction to the program that we've done together and to the journey. So, when you ask me about Cybersaathi, and to introduce that as a construct, as a practitioner, and I started practice as a criminal lawyer 30 years back, and be it hardcore criminal law or corporate crimes, one of the things that I've noticed and that permeates cyber crimes as a victim or as a perpetrator, both ways it works the same way, it is that when there is a problem, you reach out to a friend. So Cybersaathi or cyber friend, therefore, was conceptualized as the first responder, as the first person you would reach out to when in trouble. And therefore, the first person whom somebody reaches out to should have sufficient awareness, because not all of us are experts in all the topics. Yet, when someone reaches out to us as a friend, we are just there for them. And when you're there for somebody else, it could actually be for yourself too, because Cybersaathi first envisages that you will be there to protect yourself first and then others. So when you're doing that, you have to at least know the basics. The basics about what are the cyber threats and vulnerabilities that abound the domain, what are your remedies in law, and most importantly, how are you going to get those remedies? Because one, just knowing about the problem is not going to help anybody. You also need some guidance with respect to the solution. So the whole idea is to create sufficient confidence and trust for victims to reach out to systems, to reach out to systemic justice delivery, so that they don't resort to either vigilante justice, or they will not just sit back and say the system fails always. There is a clear trust deficit when it comes to systems, and therefore they may just say, let's just forget about it. And by doing that, what they are doing is they are actually emboldening the criminal. They are making the criminal so much stronger, then that criminal will definitely come back to victimize the victim again, and they're also going to victimize others. So it's really important to encourage the Indian public to seek recourse under law, because you have statistics which say there are 10 cyber crime, there are probably 10,000 cyber crimes per second. Then where are all those cyber crimes? When you look at the NCRB report in terms of cyber crimes, you see it in thousands. For a 1.3 billion populace, if there are 10,000 crimes in a second, then where are those crimes going, right? So it's obvious that most people do not report. They think they are alone in having fallen prey. They are ashamed about having fallen prey, and they somehow think they're at fault. And we did the session particularly with the gender lens in place. And for us, we were talking therefore about a much more sensitive issue also, where women and children, girl children, are victims, and therefore they think they have committed some wrong. One of the saddest cases that came out of South India was a girl's pictures were morphed and circulated on Facebook and WhatsApp, etc. Now it also got circulated amongst a community or locality. So when we talk about internet crimes, we assume it is somewhere at some kind of a distance. But when it comes to crimes like this, it happens around your vicinity. So people in and around her are shaming her because nude and sexually suggestive pictures have been morphed with her face, which in simple terms is like you combine two different pictures and create a fake picture, and it's been circulated. Unfortunately, a girl who was bold enough to go and give a criminal complaint, who told her parents about it, parents supported her to give the complaint, then committed suicide. And in her suicide note, you'll actually find it online when you look for the Vinopriya case. She specifically says that even my parents didn't believe me when I said I didn't share photographs like this. So even if she had shared, so what? She cannot be victimized like that through circulation. So it's important for victims to know when is it that they end up, where is it that they commit a crime, and where is it that they are just victims. And they should not fear the law. They should not distrust the law. They should not think the law won't work. They have to take recourse, and especially for these kind of gendered crimes, I would say for all crimes for that matter. And here is where the question that you asked also, I have to circle back to the question, that's where it becomes relevant. You need to know what are the threats and vulnerabilities. You must know what are the remedies in law and how do you avail of them. How much time will law take? Maybe if that victim had known that law takes a little bit of time to find, because today look at the situation. This person who circulated her morphed pictures was found. He has been detained under Gundas Act, which is a preventive detention mechanism. So the law did take action. It's just that the victim got too hasty, So it is good if a victim knows it is going to take some time. I have to be patient. I have to cooperate with the police. So maybe then they will also be able to, we can bridge the trust deficit. So one of the things that we've been doing through our program is this, of bridging that gap, making people understand about digital rights. And yes, it's very important to know your rights and your remedies, and most important to seek them too.
Yeah, you make a great point, because what came up in our training and continues to come up in the training is that most people are totally unaware not only in identifying the different forms of cybercrime and in general, like what kind of violence is a crime, is labeled a crime under which section of the law, and then what are the remedial measures under the law. I want to go to Samir next. You have a big portfolio where all the, in Maharashtra, all the municipalities apart from the big ones are under your responsibility. And therefore, I would like to ask you the same question. Why do you think that digital rights and safety education should be mainstream?
Yeah, very good evening. Ilsa, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be a part of the deliberations. I think this question of, why digital rights are important. I think the entire life, a substantial part of our life and substantial part of our society has now become digital. Of course, there is a lot of variation within country, within rural areas. We have got, certain states having internet penetration as high as 55%. Some states, I won't be naming them, are below 10%. So, when we talk of, despite this tremendous variations within our country, within the rural urban, within cities, within the various socio-economic strata, with the poor, with the rich, issues of gender, issues of differentially able people, issues of old or senior citizens. It is definitely a fact that despite all these variations, despite all these elements and aspects of digital divide, the society is increasingly getting digital. And maybe students of political science or law or philosophy will ultimately say that as a dominant part of our society, which is currently digital, creating a framework of rights, of responsibilities, of prescribed behavior, preferred behavior. So all these aspects of existential issues of human beings will be influenced by a dominant aspects of that society, which is very much now digital. That's the reason I feel that digital rights are extremely important, and the importance of safety education essentially comes from the various aspects or the differences in the which we call now as digital divide. So maybe someone who is very tech savvy, someone who is well read, might be aware of the rights, but our country of almost 1.4 billion now, and with this tremendous geographical variations, economic variations, climatic changes, poverty, gender issues, caste issues. So the various stratified society as ours will be indicating different types of abilities of access, different types of abilities of protection. And that's the reason I believe that the safety education within digital framework becomes extremely important. I think legally, we know the Information Technology Act of 2001 now is almost 2 decades old. Most of the, I think, police is extremely proactive in being on cyber issues. We have got cyber crime police stations now in various areas. There is a separate functional division which deals with cybercrime at state level. So is the case with defense department. We have a separate cyber command now, which is also looking after this issue. So I think as the society is getting increasingly digital, we are going e-commerce. Very frankly, I am told that e-commerce and various aspects of being digitally safe. Even I don't know that. I was just reading an article. I believe this came just today or yesterday. Enlisting the types of safety that one has to take when we are dealing with these digital issues. When e-commerce is getting so strong, obviously all of us will have to be also equally equipped of protecting ourselves. So that was my stand on why digital rights are important and why this safety education is extremely crucial. Thank you also.
Samir, you make some important points. So it's inevitable that we are heading towards a digital future. There's no getting away from it, whether you like it or not. And maybe some parts of the country are slow to catch up, but they will catch up. And we need to all be aware of it. You mentioned that people who are literate know their rights. In our opinion and in our experience of doing these workshops, even the literate and highly educated often don't know their rights. And that's why it is so important that we talk about it, because I mean, Nidhi Razdan recently was, a victim of a scam. Now people make fun of her, but she was so brave to talk about it. And not many people talk about these things, how you can get scammed online. And there are many different ways that you can get scammed online. And it's not just trolling or, harassment or threats, but also parting with personal information, morphing your pictures and videos, impersonation, etc. So it's very, very important that as we go deeper into the digital space, we are aware of how technology can be misused. I'm going to go to Dr. Purohit next. you know, you represent a university and you're constantly, and you're also in the legal profession. So can you share why it is so important that this is part of the mainstream curriculum? Because it is a 21st century skill and there's no getting away from it. We have to be discussing it.
Yeah, so respected Napinai ji, respected Samir ji, respected Elsa ji. So good to join. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Ms. Napinai ji. I just saw that she has been included under the most powerful women in the IP in India. So that was so glad to see. Now, coming to your question, I would say that if you see the educational institutions in India, so we have about 1,100 universities and over 40,000 colleges. Now, if we talk about the digital rights and the safety education, how much it is there in the curriculum, I would say that the streams like business management, law, and engineering and computer science, these are the ones where people have some awareness. But when we see the other streams, then the awareness is very low, and that is the cause of concern. Second thing is that as far as the curriculum is concerned, when we see the regulatory bodies also, very few regulatory bodies have insisted that the cybersecurity and digital rights should be included as a part of the curriculum. And that's wherein we are also about to suggest to the UGC that when they talk about the courses that have to be core courses, for instance, UGC did a very good job by including environment science as a part of the core courses across the universities. But now it is the time that maybe these aspects are also considered to be included, whether somebody is studying history or architecture or any course. Because unless and until we are able to do this, the sufficient awareness would not reflect, and thereby the problems will continue. I'm so happy that Napinai ji mentioned about the core problems that are happening in the world, and also she mentioned about the gender lens through which we can see the things. And Samir ji focused on the significance of the digital rights. So the curriculum right now requires change. It requires initiatives on the part of regulators. But apart from that, the institutions themselves, without waiting for the regulations to come, also need to take action to the extent they can. For instance, if I talk about our university, Banasthali Vidyapeeth, one thing that we did about 4 or 5 years before was we thoroughly studied the entire digital literacy and asked ourselves a question that is the digital literacy that we talk about and what NDLM used to talk about, and then later the CSC of the mighty government of India. Does this capture the requirements of an individual? The answer was no. Then we asked a second thing, that in our cultural context, the kind of digital literacy that we have, is it fulfilling the mission? Again, the answer was no. So now, if those who are there right now seeing this program, if you Google digital literacy and see the Bharti model of digital literacy, then in that case, you will find some research papers, and you will find that in the Indian context, why we need to see digital literacy in a different way. For example, a girl posts a photograph on the Facebook, and the girl's father has a conversation with his friend, and the friend says that, have you seen the kind of photo your daughter has put on the Facebook? The father sees that and is not able to sleep the entire night. What kind of digital literacy we are giving? So we need to have a different model. So we formulated a model based on responsibility, values, and security. And what we did, based on this model, we conducted some workshops, which were quite welcomed by the students. And we are very glad to partner with Red Dot Foundation and the Cyber Sati, an initiative by Ms. Napinai ji. And we could have some workshops which were immensely beneficial for the students. So as I said, that law, management, computer science, engineering, these are the segments where the awareness is good. but we need to ensure all the ways in which the ecosystem is created, whereby the awareness improves further.
Thank you. That's really interesting and important, because when we look at the jobs of the future, most of them are going to be involving some kind of digital interaction. And if our young people aren't trained in that, or for that matter, the entire population, we are going to be, losing out. And if we are ahead of the curve, then we also have that advantage. So I'm glad that at least your university has been looking at what is required for today's competitive environment to keep current. And anyway, I was so impressed with Banasthali University. I mean, I've never known for, flying school to be on campus. So it's great. Samir, we spoke about the digital divide, and you also brought in the intersectionality, like age and stuff like that. And, when we talk about the digital development, it's racing forward. It's like a Rajdhani. Every day there's some new update, there's some new app, and there's some new kind of software and stuff. And my mom, for example, can't keep up. She's just struggling. And there are so many people like that. And when you spoke about e-commerce and you talked about maybe banking, and there's so many other services that especially during a situation like a lockdown, that others who are not digitally literate cannot access or would have difficulty to access. How can we look forward thinking about policy interventions that can help bridge this digital divide? And is there something interesting that y'all are doing that you can share with us?
Yeah, actually, when you talk of policy, it can range from an act to maybe an advisory, maybe an international memorandum of understanding, international treaty. So I look at public policy at this entire gamut, which would be from making an act, a rule, a guideline, a standing order, order of the honorable court. It can be an international treaty. It can be all this range of activities. So one important thing in digital rights, still I think it's an evolving concept. So in fact, the very famous case of, I can't be taking names of companies or individuals here, but the data privacy, or the right to privacy. In fact, nothing ma'am is here. So the right to privacy is almost an enshrined constitutional fundamental right. That's the perception in India of many of the students of law and also practicing lawyers. That right to privacy is enshrined. It's a fundamental right in India, very honestly. So when we are talking of normally there is some concept called as technology lag, or a cultural lag, or a legal lag. The way technology moves, the way the world moves, and the legal framework that we have doesn't change to that level, and therefore there is always this catching up which has to be done by law vis-a-vis society, and there is more evidently regarding digital rights. So a very simple thing, like, so one of my point here was that the things are moving so fast that even the Information Technology Act of almost 20 years back now, maybe we will have to go for another round of amendment, taking into the consideration the latest things which are happening, maybe like blockchain. There's, I think, KYC is a look by suspicion by the many various people. Why do you want KYC? So very often, my personal data is my right, and if you are making money out of it, you bloody well share the amount with me. That could be one of the way of putting people making business out of your data, your information. Secondly, there is a non-private data also. The non-private data may not be exactly my right, but people are, there's a business model that is coming up. I don't want to use ideologically laden words, what we normally study in sociology, but nevertheless, these various perspectives, these various perspectives dealing with the fast, rapidly changing technology and its implication with society, vis-a-vis law, vis-a-vis rules, vis-a-vis media, vis-a-vis social relations, vis-a-vis education. So it becomes a extremely interconnected way of looking at this phenomenon, and therefore I find this idea of digital rights something which is, which requires much more deeper philosophical thinking than maybe what sociology or what political science says, because we are touching to the very core and fundamental issues of species being, in my opinion. The way I mean, in fact, railways and telegraphy was almost 150, 170 years back. Railways came even in India, it came one in 1850, and telegraphy was also there. So it's almost we all know the change which came in public policy vis-a-vis railroads, as it was called, vis-a-vis telegraphy, was it was called. And the International Telegraphic Union, ITU, I think, is the only body of international body which has survived the two world wars and the League of Nations and pandemics and meltdowns and mass the Great Depression. So we find that this very idea of digital right, it is very fundamental. It goes beyond what we're using apps or not. So the ability to comprehend these very core fundamental tectonic shifts which are happening in our society, and then coming up with a policy, public policy response. It may be in acts or rules or treaties or international conventions or whatever. So this, I think, I'm finding it, that there is a lack of unity or a singular perception into that. We are having too many perceptions and ideas and ideologies regarding this tectonic shifts, and that is making this process of public policy vis-a-vis technology or vis-a-vis digital rights extremely complicated. You will find the European Union has its own set of acts which are coming up. I think the personal data protection bill, I think, is now being discussed in the appropriate forums right now. So I find it very interesting, actually. The way technology, the way society, the way politics, media, law, crime react to these changes, and what we were maybe 100 years back and what we are now. There's so tremendous changes, that in sociology we had a term called as moral density. That whether the frequency of interactions you are having in a particular society or community. Now, as the population is now almost 8 billion now, or 800 crores, the frequency and interaction has increased so much that I personally feel that the ideologies and paradigms of maybe earlier century are now not capable of addressing and evolving these challenges that we are facing. Maybe 10 years down the line, I don't know what would happen with what we are discussing now and what policy response we'll be making. So the process of public policy making will also have to undergo a very fundamental change, a very fundamental shift to work very rapidly, work very fast. So that was, although I'm using the word public policy, ultimately is going down to the digital rights, that whether they're acknowledged or not. If law doesn't acknowledge, it's not a right. That's a very fundamental thing that man will also say that if there is no act actually acknowledging it, and there is no punishment, or and I'm not using the word, it's not just not related with criminality as such, but the very core existential issues of our society, of our generation, are also getting generated, by this overall discussion of digital rights and how to protect them. Whether, as you rightly say, in India, if there is a small tribal pocket, and if there is some criminality, digital cyber crime happens there, what will those people do? So it calls for a very renewed and very forceful functioning. And let me tell you that alone any government agency cannot do this activity. Will be requiring lots and lots of community participation in its truest sense. Any aspect of digital life will require lots of community participation, and therefore we require more and more. And that's the reason I find the activity which you do through your NGO very important, and we'll be requiring more such activities, like the Android platform idea. I don't know whether it can be translated into the usual social functioning, but this idea of this platform, anyone can come and collaborate and share and open data. So I think these what ideas we are using at technological level may also have to be translated into the social life that we are in. And I think these activities at a very core and fundamental level will also start showing its impact on various elements of social life, which also include digital right. So sorry, it was a rather a long circuitous way, but I tend to see a lot of interconnections, which I thought I should share with you. So, thank you, Elsa. Thank you.
You were very much on point, and you actually gave a great explanation. And I'd like to throw into the mix that you already put the socio-cultural norms, which I feel further this digital divide, because Dr. Purohit already spoke about the intergenerational understanding and acceptance, right? When the father's looking at the Facebook picture of what the girl has posted, these children are digital natives. They don't think, for them, there's no separation of the physical and the virtual world. Samir spoke about the freedom of speech, freedom of privacy, the right to privacy versus freedom of expression. And is our law up to date to to kind of protect our rights? But I also wanted to ask you, Napinai, because you've done a lot of work on this topic, are our policy and lawmakers also equipped to understand these dynamics that are constantly changing all the time? And how can they ensure, and we with them ensure, that this digital access is democratic and inclusive going forward? Because in bridging the digital divide, we should not violate our rights further or have our rights violated further.
Absolutely. So I would like to respond to your question, Elsa, taking also along with it one of the questions that's been posted in the chat group about activity monitoring apps for kids. So let me just start off with that as an example. One of the recent cases of a data breach was when an 8-year-old kid's activities in her room got uploaded online, because somebody hacked into the monitoring mechanism that had been put there to actually monitor the health. The person who's supposed to take care of the child too. It's like a nanny cam, and that got hacked. And in turn, what was meant for the security of the child ended up violating the privacy and rights of the child. So when we talk about monitoring apps, we have to remember and keep in mind the fact that any app, any device, any computing device, to be more precise, which is collecting data, is sending that data somewhere other than just to you. It is being shared, it is being saved, and it is being utilized for what they normally claim is marketing services. But you don't know whether that is going to be the only service that it's going to be utilized for. And this is where the question that you asked about the role of law and protection comes into play, because ultimately, what is the purpose behind law? Whenever you look at technology, and you ask technologists, they love it when they're left to play on their own. They hate the word regulation. They think regulation is antithesis to innovation, whereas that's not really the case. You need regulation to help innovation. You need laws to support innovation. So Dr. Purohit mentioned about my practice area or focus area of intellectual property rights. So I'm going to take that as one example. You are a technologist and you're developing the app. You're also providing it free of cost. So there is always a payment. Apart from the fact that the user is the product, there is a lot more which is actually hidden at the second and third layer, a lot of which Mr. Unale mentioned in terms of the personal data and non-personal data, etc. So who decides how all of this should be used? The first level is you have developed the app, you therefore want to protect your rights on the app. So if you think that regulation is a bad word or law is a bad word, and that you want to just be left alone to do whatever you want to do, imagine then law is also not going to be there to help you to protect your own innovation. You want to monetize on that invention, right? So that is where law is actually an enabler. It comes in to help you monetize, and in the right way. It tells you what is permissible to do and what is not. Because if you have spent a few months developing something and then you launch it, and then somebody comes and says, sorry, this is illegal, and blocks it, then all that work that you've done till that time is gone. And you may also end up facing prosecution. So it's better for you to know the clarity in law. So better for you to know in advance what is permissible in law and what is not. And then it comes to the user protection. It is great for us whenever we get something for free. I always say that is literally the sexiest four-letter word you can ever come across, right? The word free. But then free always comes with strings attached, right? So you need to know what are those strings attached with that free product. You have to have control over it. Today, we are talking about whether WhatsApp is entitled to put its own privacy policy, change its privacy policy after it has made itself very inherent in our everyday life. So merely because somebody is giving you something for free does not mean they can act to your detriment. And here is where, therefore, law plays a role. Today, we need law to intervene. We need the justice delivery system to intervene to tell us whether a free app like WhatsApp can change its privacy policy midway and tell you to take it or leave it. And I can tell you right away that in the US, this situation has already arisen, and not necessarily in terms of WhatsApp and privacy policy, but in terms of an app or a platform enforcing its own policies, changing it midway, and then saying you have the option of leaving it, right? And the US courts held that it cannot insist on that. It cannot give what is called as a Hobson's choice to users, that users are entitled to conscionable terms. So anything that's unconscionable can be struck down by courts. Therefore, merely because you see something which is a one-sided agreement does not mean that it has to be accepted. Again, here is where law comes to play a role in terms of user protection. So whether you are the app developer or a platform developer, whether you are the user, and of course, we cannot shy away from the fact that there are certain mandatory compliances that are required from a government perspective. So from a government perspective, regulation comes in to protect you and to prevent abuse and to punish where there is a violation of laid down regulations, right? So for all of these also, there are enablers which come with regulatory mechanisms. So when you look at all of these, and when you look at it from all the different perspectives that Mr. Unale just brought before you, be it in terms of security, be it in terms of your privacy or your personal data or non-personal data, and what it can be put to use for, and be it in terms of how and in what manner an app or an intrusive technology can be used, and how can the data that is collected through intrusive technologies are being used, it's so much important that we have laws and that we have very clear and precise laws which all of us as users, as citizens can understand and comply with and know the consequences of violating it.
Thanks, Napinai. And as a user, whether you're a student or a teacher or a principal, what is the responsibility to make sure that everybody is up to date? Because suddenly we are in a situation like the pandemic where everything's shut and education has moved online, but teachers and schools weren't really prepared for it, or parents for that matter, or children. And I saw there were a few questions related to educational resources. As parents, I think it's very important that you try to understand the tech and the features, the security features. For example, YouTube has a kids YouTube, and many parents don't know that. If they allow their children to access YouTube and not the kids' YouTube, they are exposed to all kinds of content. So I had somebody reach out to say that their child wanted to understand. He was reading something, so he wanted to understand a particular part of the body, and in searching for it, he was led down a rabbit hole where he ended up watching porn. And she came across it. And then she called me up and I asked her what YouTube was he watching. And she had never heard of YouTube for kids. Now, this goes back to literate and educated parents. Do they even know about these features? So it's up to us to keep abreast. It means we have to invest in this kind of upskilling ourselves. What is available, what is not available, what are the privacy features, etc. But I want to go to Dr. Purohit and ask him, now that all the schools are online in the digital space, and this whole ecosystem of teachers, students, parents are all part of the user ecosystem. So how can we ensure that everybody is up to date with their rights, but also what can be done to improve this awareness? Apart from hosting these workshops, how can we make it part of our DNA? It's like a checklist that everybody has on top of their minds.
Yes, that's very nice, Ms. Elsa. And I think quite compliment the thought that Ms. Nappinaiji was mentioning, that carefully laid down regulations and implemented regulations would definitely help in innovation. So that's the very right thing. Now, as far as our university, Banustali Vidyapeeth, is concerned, from April 2020, we have been holding the classes online. And that, I understand, has brought a very different picture, because earlier the student was not that much time online, but now the number of hours she's online are more. So owing to that, we had to go for several things. And I would like to mention that, first of all, we went for a low bandwidth access. And then apart from the low bandwidth access, we also ensured a flexibility on the part of the learner, and also motivated them that they should use the digital gadgets and be in the online world, keeping a sense of responsibility. And at the same time, we also ensured that we don't compromise with the quality. So there has to be a compatible quality and whatever we do. We have a learning management system through which we ensure that only the authorized users, they get the access. And apart from that, all the learners have their official email IDs, so that when the classes or the other interactions are going on, then we only have the familiar people over there, or the ones who are authorized. And also, apart from that, the awareness, assessment and action, they need to go hand in hand in order to ensure that what we plan, we are actually able to achieve that. Now, here what we have done is that since we have a school of law as well, so the school of law that has a legal aid cell, that cell has been very useful, because it, when there is a peer connect, among the students, then that helps a lot. So that is first thing. Then apart from that, all our courses, they have some other course coordinator. For example, in the case of MBA, we have one person, Dr. Pavandeep Bindra, who is quite incidentally also right now listening to us. So she has been the coordinator, and the several things which the coordinators are required to do. One of the core things is to ensure that if any student has a kind of problem regarding the cyber security or something that violates our digital rights, then immediately we come into action, and then our cell, including the university's legal cell, also comes into action, and accordingly we talk to the student and the parent and take the required remedial action. But yes, the overall things are interwoven around being proactive, and but at the same time, the mechanism has to be in place, so that the way we react to any kind of unfortunate thing that happens, that is also quite pragmatic in nature. So on the whole, our experience last 1 year with the entire online education and all, we would say it has been quite satisfactory. There have been challenges, but I think we have been able to manage.
Thank you for that. And we have a couple of questions. I think Napina, you already answered, but we had Charu who asked about teachers and how can we carry them along in this awareness program. And I want to tell everyone that teachers are a big part of our Cyber Sathi programs, because if we are telling the young people or the children that they can go to a trusted adult or go to somebody, and the teacher who's in their circle of trust doesn't know how to respond, it defeats this whole exercise. And so teachers, the school education authorities, all of them are part of this, and their own parents are also invited to participate in this program. So yeah, we'd be very happy to partner with you if you want to, conduct and facilitate a session. There was another one by Harini, who's also a Chevening alumni, Napinai, and she asked if there were any specific child-friendly resources. So do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think in fact I had answered Harini's question in part about activity monitoring apps, but the first part of it, I realized that there is a lot of content and data nowadays with respect to cyber safety or security. But a lot of it is a little preachy. For instance, there was a recent one which could have been a much more effective process through the Ministry of Home Affairs, but they called it Cyber Girl. It is still important, so I would still request you to have a look at it. But it talks about what a girl should do or should not do. So one of the distinctions that I've tried to bring in terms of even the address in the book, which I've written in the chat section, which will be coming out and which will have probably a same or similar name as Cyber Sathi, is to not tell people what they should or should not do. It's more important to explain what are the threats and vulnerabilities, and then leave it to them to decide how they want to go about it. As another participant has rightly pointed out, the minute you put a lock, the child becomes curious. So they want to know what is behind that locked door. And what they may not otherwise be interested in, they become interested in that. And this is what also a lot of predators use. So as you rightly pointed out, Elsa, one of the things is AI going wrong because of the kind of content you may watch on YouTube, and it reads it wrong and then ends up actually diverting you to pornographic content, and you're a child, right? The other aspect of it is where either through social media platforms or even gaming platforms, predators reach out and start sharing pornographic content, and that's a way of grooming you for you to then share in turn. So it's one of the most dangerous ways of grooming, which is adapted in terms of online spaces. That is the reason why I said that monitoring apps per se may not really be effective, because children will find a way around it. The better thing to do is you have to inform them. See, today, how early do we start with a child on good touch, bad touch? When we were children, nobody had to tell us that early. Whereas now, for even a 5-year-old child will teach its peer about good touch, bad touch, because they have been told about it much earlier. Today, from the time the child is capable of moving its hands and eyes and wants to look at something to be distracted, you are distracting the child by using a computing device. So when somebody asked me a couple of years back about, new age toys or something, I told them there are 3 toys, your computer, iPad or its equivalent, and a mobile phone. That is the toy that every child is playing with. So when you ask about what is the age from when you have to teach a child about cyber safety, it is the age from when you equip it with a device. So when you give the weapon in the hands of the child, they also have to be told about the safety catch, when to stop, when does it become a crime, and when is it permissible, right? You don't know what kind of usage a child is putting a mobile phone camera to. When do we think we have to tell them? Are we going to brush things aside by saying, but he's only a child, so it's okay if he did something wrong? Or are we going to take responsibility and say, no, whoever it is, whatever the age, wrong is wrong, and tell them at that age, right? And I'm not saying only boys commit wrongs, girls commit equally, right? So they have to be told, unfortunately, or otherwise, most of the laws are gendered. So when it comes to awareness, therefore, we have to start at the earliest. When it comes to protective or preventive measures, you're right, child lock alone will not do. You do have a lot of others. If you're talking specifically about pornographic content, you have apps for that also called Pic Purify and Equivalence, which will ensure that certain kinds, it uses artificial intelligence to identify nudity and certain other contours. And if that content is there, it may be filtering out news and good items also, but by way of abundant precaution, it just filters everything. And most of the time, we have done a test also in the process of one case I have been appearing in as amicus before the Supreme Court, and we did find that the positives were pretty high. The percentage where it works well was pretty high, and it was good. So there are a lot of similar tools which you can deploy beyond just a child lock. In fact, one of the things that's come up with the recent intermediary guidelines that the government has come out with are these kind of measures that social media platforms have to take to ensure that they provide a cleaner platform. But we have to wait and see how far it's going to be effective.
I'd like to add that one preventive measure is, as a parent or as an adult with children around, just have honest conversations. You know, if you create that barrier where they can't even ask you a doubt or ask you for help, then no amount of these precautionary measures are going to help. You wanted to add, Napinai?
Yes, and that is the intent and purpose behind Cyber Sati. The parents also have to be Satis to their children.
Yeah. So, you know, like we did a workshop in one of the schools, and the principal was telling us that a 4-year-old, not a 4-year-old, a girl in the 4th standard, she kept falling asleep during class. And when they dug deeper to understand like why she always sleeping in class, it was because her parents were giving her the iPad because they were abdicating their responsibility of entertaining her or, you know, talking to her. As a result, she ended up watching porn and she was addicted to porn. And so now that child has to go for counseling, and she's only in the 4th grade. That child doesn't know what porn is, but if she's exposed to it at an early age and the parents are clueless and it's the school who picks it up, I think there's something going wrong in our society. So every adult has to be aware of what's what's the reality, what's the situation, and how can we protect each other, how can we be friends to each other. So I don't want to end on a sad note, but I'm going to ask all three of you, looking forward, knowing that we are going to go into even more heavy usage of digital, what is the one thing that you would recommend to everybody, whether it's a user or a designer or a policy maker, to keep in mind, so that we don't further the digital divide and make access to this space democratic and inclusive and safe? Samir.
I think one of the first thing that comes to my mind would be, we should make mandatory to every ICT device manufacturer, to every app, to every software, whatever, that they should be including a full disclaimer or a full, probable issues vis-a-vis digital safety into their app itself. Earlier we had there is one screen of showing the licensing and other forms. So similar, there is always a help section also in most of the either softwares or these apps. So each and every there could be one option of creating such a regulation that any and every app, any and every website, any and every such social media site will have to include one section which deals with the FAQs or the probable, issues of safety in their app or in the software. I think that would be helpful to inform people much more than the other options we have. Yeah, thank you, Elsa.
I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you for sharing that. I noticed Dr. Rafia had a hand up. Would you like to, say? Dr. Rafia, did you want to ask a question? Maybe you can put it in the chat section. Dr. Purohit, maybe you can. Yes, Dr. Rafia, did you want to ask a question?
No, ma'am, I was just checking out whether what were the questions in the chat. So by mistake, it happened. So sorry.
Okay, no worries. Dr. Purohit, what would be your one recommendation?
I have one recommendation on the proactive side, that when it comes to creating the awareness in the training programs, we need to keep the cultural context in mind. And on the reactive side, my one recommendation is that whosoever, we have to make our mechanism such that anyone who suffers from a problem is able to find the remedy faster. So for example, as a university, it's my responsibility. If my student faces any problem, I have to give a solution to the student.
Thank you. That's really great. And, currently, I think the social media guidelines say it's 36 hours. And whilst that's great, from the government side to put these restrictions and these stipulations on the intermediaries, I feel 36 hours is way too long, especially when a crime is being committed and it has the potential to be made viral around the world, and that crime being furthered over and over again a million times. So yeah, I do feel that everyone should have that inherent responsibility to make sure that they are equipped, they are knowledgeable, and that they put in place safeguard measures. So thank you, and I'm glad that Banastali, University is actually doing it, and it can be the gold standard for other universities too. Napinai, what about you?
Very quick suggestion from my end would be that, yes, cyber safety has to be part of an education module. It has to be introduced from school level and not just college level. And we don't have to wait for the government to come and tell us that it is essential. All of us have already identified the need. We can immediately plug the gap right away. Because, everybody assumes this is not my problem, right? The parents cannot take on this issue on their own. It has to be done through educational institutions. The educational institutions may think that they are taking on a parental role in conducting this as a curriculum, as part of a curriculum. But then what they are really doing is not just providing the parental role. They are actually doing something which is going to benefit each and every student in understanding cyber safety and also protecting the school or the college or the educational institution and its reputation also. We have seen what happened when things like the boys' locker room case and all that came up. It wasn't just the students who became the victims, the institution also got victimized in the process. So, one, you need it as a curriculum. We hope and we wait for the government to introduce it. In the meantime, we are all aware of self-regulatory mechanisms. Similarly, why not start and introduce this as part of a curriculum independent of what is mandated by a government or a regulatory mechanism? That's what I would hope for.
That's true. Why wait for it to, come through the formal system? Nothing stops us from educating ourselves or, reaching out to people who are who have that knowledge. I noticed Dr. Pavandeep had her hand up. Would you like to? Yeah. Yes,
Namaskar,
Dr.
ma'am.
Yeah.
And namaskar to everyone. Actually, I have posted this question in the chat box also, that Nowadays, we observe that it's difficult to even feed a child without a mobile. Like mothers, they have the baby in their prams and strollers, and they have just given a mobile to the kid, and then mother is all absolutely all right, and the baby is already all right. What? Because I just feel that at the time when our nannies and daddies they feed our parents, that time there's no digitalization, nothing like that. But still they get. So I just have a question. Like we have a lot of technicalities nowadays, like related to rights, duties, and cyber security and all that. Just a question, like we are going so much technical nowadays, whether it's not hampering our like the generation, like the growth of our generation, where like where we are heading from that golden era of old days, what our grandparents they have, and now where our child is growing. So whether a lot of technicalities leads to something bad, just out of curiosity I'm asking this, because I'm also a mother of a 6-year-old child.
So my quick response is that technology is not bad. It's how it is used, and that is human, right? If it's designed to be used in a positive manner or negative manner is totally up to the inventor, the creator, and also the user. So I would suggest that we also keep an open mind, because when I do a lot of sessions on how do you use social media for social good, often teachers and adults are reluctant to use social media, and they think of it as bad all the time. But it's not bad, it's how we use it, right? And I have personally benefited from a lot of good that has come out of it. I have made so many friends who I have not met in person around the world. I've had people support my work because they found me on the internet, so there's so much that can come out of it, and we can support each other. We can be peers, not just in times of crisis, but also exchange knowledge. It's just another space, and we have to get comfortable thinking about it like that. But in being comfortable, we should also know that we have our rights. We should be safe, and we should also know when we are crossing boundaries and breaking laws. So that is my quick answer to you. But maybe Dr. Purohit and then Napinai last word.
Yes, so that's right. I think we are in a world that is characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and now two more things have come up. That is the nature apathy and wisdomlessness. So, in fact, if I quote one shlok from Sanskrit, it says that yasya nasti swayam pragya, shastram tasya karoti kim. So, if someone does not have wisdom, what the literature and the awareness can do for the person? Lochanabhyam vihinasya darpanam kim karishyati. So, what it means, a person who cannot see, the mirror cannot do anything for the person. So, I mean, we have to be people with wisdom and then take up the things accordingly so that we are safe, our all students, our daughters, everyone is safe.
So very quickly, if I may come in, I would say what you have raised is actually a very practical problem, because we may speak about cyber safety, we may speak about the do's and don'ts. This is precisely why I don't like a do's and don'ts list, because if somebody says stay away from social media, you can't. If you're going to be told that let a child suffer but don't show him or her television or a mobile or whatever, it's not going to happen, right? So you need to therefore look at it with practical lens. And when I look at it with practical lens, the way I see it is, it's not just for students, what I said about just telling them what are the harms, what are the problems, but also parents or teachers, and then leaving it to them to decide what is best for them. So once you know what the threats are, what the vulnerabilities are, chances are you will figure out how to ring fence it. We did not have technology in our time. We also must have been truant children, right? I was very naughty. I remember. I still am predominantly, right? So if I'm going to be so naughty, if I'm going to say I will not follow rules and I will not be in a particular way, earlier without technology, also parents had to find ways to deal with it, and they dealt with it, and we grew up therefore as responsible adults. At least that's what I'd like to believe of myself. So similarly, today in a technology mediated world also, we just have to find what is the new normal in terms of how do you ensure that responsibility in the child, internalize that responsibility, so that irrespective of your presence, irrespective of whether you're watching over their shoulder, they're going to keep themselves safe. So you really have to equip them to keep themselves safe. If you believe that it's your role as a parent or an adult to keep the children safe, it's not going to happen 24/7 in today's technology mediated world. It could not have happened even in a physical world. You needed to make the child aware of threats. And today, therefore, and also we have to remember something else. It may be a fourth grade or fifth grade child also. When you buy a new mobile, you don't know how to deal with it. You take it to that child to get it sorted. You want the child to help you, get started with technology, how to use technology. When something crashes at home, the first person you reach out to is the youngster in the house. What Elsa was referring to, the digital natives. We are all the digital immigrants, as Prensky calls us. So given this circumstance, you have given that power in the hands of the child to believe that they know this world better than you do. So if you're going to try telling them about problems, they're not going to listen to you. Whereas if they learn and they come and tell you, Mama, you have to be careful because, you don't know, bad videos may come up when you're watching YouTube also. Of course, YouTube has great content. All of us are in it, but we have to watch out for those pitfalls, right? So the child will then come and tell you what to be careful about. And when they do that, they will keep themselves safe and not just you. And again, that was the whole intent and purpose behind making each of us a cyber sati. And therefore, we can be satis for others also. I know it may sound utopian, but I generally believe that it is possible.
Well, thank you so much. And I've put in the chat section the report from this entire project that we did, which is Cyber Sati, awareness of cyber crimes using a gender lens. And I'd like to thank the British High Commission for giving us this opportunity to do this project as part of the Chevening alumni. It's an amazing program and an amazing network of professionals. And we take this kind of education, digital rights and online safety and gender sensitivity training very seriously in our Chevening alumni network. I've had the privilege of hosting many such workshops with Napinai as well. And if you would like to do, host these workshops in your schools or colleges, do get in touch. We'd love to partner with you. Yes, Napinai.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know what, Elsa, the first time I thought about this concept of Cyber Sati was when I was at the Chevening program in UK. We had just returned from a meeting at the equivalent of our crime branch, okay, in UK. And we had the session with their law enforcement agencies on child related cyber security issues, cyber crimes that affect children. And that's when I was hearing about the kind of initiatives that they were taking, where they even cater to, through cartoons and animation, they cater to the requirement of even 5-year-olds. They have age mediated content for 5 to 8, 8 to 12, 12 to 14, and 14 above, and all that. And it's called ncp.org. So if you go to the site, you will also be able to probably see this content also. So the first time I thought about this as an initiative was thanks to Chevening. So it's really lovely that we actually kickstarted the Cyber Sati initiative together with Chevening. So thanks from my end also to Chevening for this
Yeah.
enabling us.
Yeah. Thank you, Supriya, and thank you, Andrew, for your support. Andrew was on one of our panels earlier, not earlier this year, late last year in October. But today we had a great discussion, and I'd like to thank Dr. Purohit, Napinai, as well as Samir Unhale. I think he had to run. But I hope you enjoyed it, and do get in touch. We'd love to partner with you, because this is such an important discussion. We cannot wait for other people to take action. We have to take action ourselves if we want our children to be protected, but also ourselves to be protected. Thank you. And I'm going to end the recording and the live stream, but